I never meant to fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder, especially not one that smelled like danger and money and something colder than winter steel. But when you've been running on no sleep for 48 hours, dragging a suitcase that's older than your dreams, and boarding a midnight flight out of Atlanta toward a country you've only ever seen on K-dramas, logic becomes a whisper, and exhaustion becomes law. The first thing I noticed about him was his silence. Not the polite kind you find in business class where people pretend they're too important to speak, but the kind that hums beneath your skin, that makes you aware of every breath you take. He sat there in the window seat, dressed in black from shirt to shoes, not a wrinkle on him, not a movement out of place. His jaw looked sculpted from stone, his eyes sharp, heavy-lidded and unreadable. And even though he didn't say a word, I felt as though he was watching everything. Me, the flight attendants, the world outside. I told myself to mind my business. I was going to Korea for a new start, an English teaching job that promised to pay more than I'd ever made back home, and I didn't need distractions, especially not the kind that came wrapped in danger and cheekbones. But halfway through the flight, after the first movie ended and the cabin lights dimmed, I felt the fatigue sink into me like wet cement. The hum of the engines was hypnotic, the air recycled and warm, and his cologne, woodsy, dark, faintly sweet, made my eyelids heavier with each inhale. I tried to resist. I did. I told myself not to fall asleep, not to be that girl who drools on strangers, but the turbulence came suddenly, shaking the plane and sending my head lolling sideways. And before I could stop myself, I was leaning against him, my cheek resting against his shoulder, my breath hitching with embarrassment even as my body betrayed me. He didn't move. That was the strangest part. Most people would have shifted, coughed, cleared their throat, done something to reclaim their space. But he didn't. His body stayed still, only his arm adjusting slightly, as if to make me more comfortable. I remember the steady beat of his heart beneath my ear, the quiet strength of his breathing, the scent of something that felt like secrets. When I woke, the cabin lights were back on. The seat beside me was empty. At first, I thought he'd gone to the restroom, but his tray was cleared, his blanket neatly folded, and there was no sign he'd ever been there. My head still tingled from where it had rested on him, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an ache of disappointment. It wasn't until I reached immigration that the strangeness began. "Passport, please," the officer said, and I reached into my bag with the calm confidence of someone who'd triple-checked everything before boarding. But when my fingers touched nothing but air, a cold wave rolled through me. I unzipped every pocket, checked the seat of my carry-on, the side pouch, even the folder with my teaching contract. Nothing. My passport was gone. "Miss?" the officer said again, his eyes narrowing slightly. I must have dropped it on the plane," I stammered, forcing a nervous laugh. "Can I go back and check?" He shook his head, muttering something in Korean, then picked up the phone beside him. Within moments, 2 uniformed security officers appeared, their expressions polite but unreadable. I tried to explain, my voice shaking, my hands gesturing wildly, but they only exchanged a glance and nodded for me to follow. That's when fear began to bloom in my chest. They led me through a series of sterile hallways that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, until we stopped at a glass-walled office. A man in a dark suit waited inside, tapping his pen on the desk. His English was smooth but clipped when he said, "Mrs. Jang, your husband is waiting." I blinked. "Excuse me, I'm not married." The man tilted his head slightly, studying me like a puzzle he already knew the answer to. "Your husband is very concerned. He has already arranged your pickup." "I think there's been a mistake," I said, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. "I don't have a husband. I'm here for work." But the door opened before I could finish. And there he was. The man from the plane. He filled the doorway like a shadow made solid, his black coat draped over his arm, his gaze locked on me with an intensity that made the air feel thin. The officers straightened instinctively, as though gravity itself had shifted. He didn't speak at first, just walked forward until he was close enough for me to smell that same woodsy cologne that had haunted my dreams for the past few hours. "Amara," he said, his voice low, smooth and devastatingly calm. "You shouldn't have wandered off." I stared at him, my mouth dry. What? Who are you? And how do you know my name?" His lips curved, just slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was a warning dressed as one. "Your passport was under my seat. I handled the paperwork while you slept." My chest tightened. "What paperwork?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward me. Inside was a marriage certificate, my name printed neatly beside his, Jang Tae-yun. The ink was fresh, the stamp official. "This is insane," I whispered, shaking my head. "This can't be real. I didn't sign anything." "You did," he interrupted softly, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You just don't remember." The way he said it, quiet, deliberate, final, made my stomach twist. I laughed, because it was either that or scream. "Is this some kind of scam? Are you trying to kidnap me?" He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "If I wanted to kidnap you, Amara, you wouldn't be sitting here. You'd already be home, my home." The room tilted slightly. "You're crazy," I whispered. "Maybe," he murmured, his eyes flicking down to my trembling hands. "But you're mine now, and that makes you a little crazy too." I pushed back my chair, but one of the guards stepped in front of the door. Tae-yun's gaze never left me as he spoke to them in rapid Korean. They nodded once and left the room. Now it was just the two of us. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood, his movements deliberate, graceful, controlled. "I want what's already mine, and I want you to understand something very clearly." He paused, his dark eyes meeting mine. "You got caught in something bigger than you realize. Someone used you, Amara. Someone thought they could slip something past me by putting it in your hands. They were wrong." He turned toward the door, then looked back over his shoulder. "Come with me quietly, and I'll keep you safe. Or stay here and explain to the police why your name is on documents tied to a smuggling ring." My knees felt weak, the words sinking like ice into my bloodstream. "You're lying," I said, but it came out like a prayer rather than an accusation. He smiled faintly. "You'll see soon enough." He walked out of the room without looking back, and I was left staring at the open door, at the life I'd planned vanishing like smoke. I should have run, I should have screamed, but something in his voice, something dark, certain and almost protective, made my feet move before my mind could stop them. And as I followed him out into the blinding lights of the Seoul night, my only thought was this: I had fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder and woken up belonging to him. If I had thought the airport was a maze of confusion, the world outside was a dream blurred by city lights and fear, the kind that wraps itself around your ribs and squeezes until you forget what it feels like to breathe normally. The moment I stepped through those glass doors, the cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and sobering, carrying with it the scent of rain and exhaust and the distant pulse of a city that never seemed to sleep. Seoul stretched out before me, vast and glittering, a living machine of motion and noise, and in the middle of it, I stood beside a man who felt like silence carved into human form. Jang Tae-yun didn't speak as we walked to the waiting car. His men, because that's what they were, not drivers or assistants, but men who moved with quiet obedience and cold precision, opened the doors and bowed slightly as he guided me inside. I tried to keep my chin up, to look unimpressed, even though my hands were shaking so hard I had to hide them in my lap. The car was sleek, black, and smelled faintly of leather, and something more dangerous. Gun oil, maybe. Or just the weight of secrets too heavy to breathe around. I wanted to demand answers, to tell him this was all some ridiculous mistake, but every time I looked at him, the words withered on my tongue. He sat beside me, the faint glow from the streetlights painting sharp angles across his face, his eyes unreadable and focused on something far away. There was power in that silence, the kind that didn't need to be announced, the kind that made everyone around him shrink a little without knowing why. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound brave. "And what did you mean by saying I was used?" He didn't look at me right away, just exhaled slowly, like he was deciding whether I was worth explaining things to. "I'm someone you shouldn't have met," he said finally, his tone calm, almost conversational. "And yet, here you are. You were on a list. A name that appeared where it shouldn't have. Someone tried to move something through that flight, and they used your documents as cover. That's why your passport disappeared. That's why you're here now." I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my throat. "That doesn't make sense," I said, my voice rising. "I don't even know anyone here. I was just coming for a teaching job." He turned his head then, his gaze cutting into mine like a blade. "That job offer wasn't real, Amara." The sound of my name on his lips sent a chill down my spine, because he said it too easily, like he'd been saying it for years. "It was a setup," he continued, his voice low, deliberate, dangerous. "They wanted someone innocent, someone forgettable, someone who wouldn't be checked too closely. They wanted you." I shook my head, pressing my palms against my knees as though I could stop the shaking if I just held on tight enough. "You're lying," I whispered. "This is insane." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Do you think I'd go through the trouble of creating a marriage certificate for a woman I didn't know if this were a joke?" The words hit me like a physical blow. "Why a marriage certificate?" I demanded. "What are you trying to gain from this? What could possibly—" He interrupted me with a faint smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Protection. For both of us. You were caught in something that could have gotten you killed. This way, no one touches you. They wouldn't dare touch my wife." "My wife?" The words echoed inside my skull, loud and absurd and terrifying. "I'm not your wife," I said fiercely, even though my voice cracked halfway through. He didn't argue. He just tilted his head slightly, studying me as though memorizing my face. "Not yet," he murmured. Something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. The car slowed, gliding to a stop in front of a building so tall and pristine it almost didn't look real. Glass and steel rose into the night sky, the reflection of the city shimmering across its mirrored surface. The men outside stepped forward again, opening the door for us. I didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening," I said, forcing the words through the fear clawing up my throat. Taeyoon sighed softly, then turned to me with a calm that was almost cruel. "You have two choices, Amara," he said. "You can come with me and stay alive, or you can refuse, and I'll tell the authorities that your name is on smuggling documents tied to the Jang Syndicate. Do you know what happens to foreigners caught in Korean organized crime cases?" He paused, his tone almost gentle. "They disappear." I felt my heart plummet, my throat tightening. "You're blackmailing me," I whispered. "I'm saving you," he corrected quietly, "even if you don't understand that yet." I wanted to scream, to claw at him, to run into the street and disappear into the crowd, but something in his expression, cold certainty, the quiet promise of danger, told me he wasn't bluffing. So I did the only thing I could. I followed him. Inside, the air was colder, quieter. The lobby was empty except for a single receptionist who bowed deeply as we entered. Taeyoon didn't look at her. He just walked past, and she didn't dare stop him. The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of machinery and the pounding of my own heartbeat. When the doors opened, we stepped into a space that looked nothing like a home, and everything like a fortress. The walls were lined with glass, the floors dark marble, the city lights spreading out below like a sea of stars. I could see men stationed outside through the windows, guards, definitely. And something inside me twisted with realization. Whatever this man was, he wasn't just rich, he was powerful. The kind of powerful that didn't come from business meetings or polite negotiations. He gestured toward the living area, his voice calm but firm. "Sit." I hesitated, then sank onto the edge of the couch, my mind spinning. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Do I just pretend to be your wife until you decide I'm free?" He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. The reflection of the city cast light across his face, making him look almost unreal. "You're not pretending," he said softly. "For now, you are my wife. You'll stay here, you'll eat here, you'll do what I tell you." Anger flared in me, cutting through the fear. "You can't just control me. I'm not one of your whatever they are." He turned slowly, his gaze locking onto mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker behind the steel, a flash of regret, or maybe recognition, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You don't understand what you've walked into, Amara. You think this is about control, but it's about survival. You're safe here because I said you are. Out there, your name is already marked." "My name?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "Whoever set you up, they knew my people would find out. They wanted to test me, to see if I'd protect a stranger. That means they're watching, and they won't stop until they know what you mean to me." "And what do I mean to you?" I asked, though my voice trembled as I said it. He smiled then, a slow, haunting smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're my weakness," he said quietly. "Or at least, that's what they want me to believe." The words sank into the air between us, thick and suffocating, as he turned away. He poured himself a drink, the sound of the glass against the counter sharp in the silence. "Rest," he said finally, not looking at me. "We'll talk tomorrow. There's much you need to learn before this gets worse." I sat there for a long moment, staring at the man who had turned my world inside out, wondering if he was a savior, a monster, or something far more complicated. And as I followed the maid who appeared wordlessly to show me to a guest room that looked more like a gilded cage, one thought echoed in my mind, looping endlessly as sleep refused to come. If this was just the beginning, what would he do when he finally decided I belonged to him completely? When I woke the next morning, the room was soaked in sunlight that felt too clean, too gentle for the kind of night I'd survived. And for a moment I forgot where I was. The silk sheets, the unfamiliar ceiling, the faint hum of the city beneath the glass walls all blurred together into something almost dreamlike. Until I turned my head and saw the security camera glinting discreetly from the corner of the ceiling, its small red light pulsing like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, and everything came rushing back in a single, suffocating wave. I sat up slowly, my throat dry, my body heavy. The air thick with that sterile kind of quiet you only find in places that aren't meant to be lived in but controlled. And as I looked around, I realized that even the beauty of the room, the marble floors, the minimalist furniture, the view that could have been painted by God himself, couldn't hide the truth that it wasn't a home, it was a cage, and I was the prettiest bird inside it. The door opened softly before I could gather my thoughts, and a woman stepped in. Mid-30s, maybe. Graceful. Dressed in black from collar to heel, her expression calm but unreadable, her dark hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. And she bowed slightly before speaking in lightly accented English. "Good morning, Mrs. Jang. Breakfast is ready?" For a moment, I just stared at her. That name, Mrs. Jang, slicing through me like ice. "Please don't call me that," I said, my voice rough, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. She blinked once as if the request didn't compute. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Mr. Jang gave instructions." Of course he did, I muttered, swinging my legs off the bed. My body still ached, but not from sleep, from tension, from the way fear curls itself around your muscles and refuses to let go. I followed her down a hallway so long and quiet it felt like it was holding its breath. Every few steps there was another camera, another door, another reminder that nothing here was accidental. When we finally entered the dining area, an open expanse of glass and dark wood with a view of the Han River glittering in the distance, I saw him sitting there, perfectly composed, as if the chaos of the previous night had never happened. Zhang Taiyun. He was reading something on his phone, a small frown creasing his brow, and when he looked up, the full force of his gaze hit me like a physical thing. Calm, unreadable, but too intense to be polite. He gestured to the seat across from him, and even though every nerve in my body screamed, "Don't," I sat. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his tone almost courteous, as if we were strangers sharing a meal instead of prisoner and captor. I met his gaze, trying to sound steady. "Not particularly. Hard to sleep when you're being watched." He didn't deny it, just set down his phone and leaned back slightly. "You'll get used to it." "I'm not planning to stay long enough to get used to anything." He smiled faintly, that dangerous, knowing kind of smile that never touched his eyes. "You're still pretending you have a choice." The woman from before returned then, setting a tray on the table. Fresh fruit, eggs, rice, soup. Everything arranged with military precision. My stomach growled in betrayal, but I kept my chin up. "Why am I here?" I asked finally, watching him cut neatly into a piece of fruit like we were discussing the weather. "You keep saying someone used me, but you haven't told me who or why." He glanced at me, then set his fork down, his expression thoughtful. "Because I don't know yet. But whoever it was wanted to test me, to provoke me. They used your name, your innocence, to see what I'd do." He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening just enough to make it worse. "And now, Amara, everyone who matters thinks you're my wife. If I tell them otherwise, you'll be dead before the truth reaches them." I felt the color drain from my face, my pulse stuttering. "You can't keep me here forever." "I don't plan to," he said simply, "but until I find out who's behind this, you'll stay where I can see you." I wanted to argue, to scream, to tell him I wasn't some chess piece in his bloody game. But before I could speak, a voice from the hallway broke the tension, low, lazy, and threaded with amusement. "Hyung, you're scaring the poor girl." A man stepped into the room, younger, sharper, dressed in casual clothes that couldn't hide the same undercurrent of danger that clung to Taiyun like a scent. His hair was slightly tousled, his grin too easy, his eyes warm in a way that didn't quite reach sincerity. Taiyun didn't look at him, just sighed. "Minho, don't you have somewhere to be?" "Nowhere more interesting than this," the younger man said, his gaze sliding to me. "So this is the wife you picked up on an airplane. She's beautiful. You always did have good taste." "Minho," Taiyun said quietly, and even though his tone didn't rise, the temperature in the room dropped. Minho only smiled wider, holding up his hands in mock surrender before sinking into a chair beside me. "I'm kidding," he said, leaning closer. "Mostly. I'm Minho, the useless little brother. Don't worry, I bite less than he does." I couldn't help it. A nervous, breathy laugh escaped me, the absurdity of it all breaking through for a split second. Minho grinned, clearly pleased with himself, and for a moment I almost believed he was harmless. Almost. But then I caught the flicker of something cold in his eyes as he glanced at Taiyun. Something like envy. Something sharper than brotherly teasing. And the illusion cracked. The rest of breakfast passed in uneasy silence, Minho's occasional smirks balanced by Taiyun's quiet intensity. When it was over, Taiyun stood, gesturing for me to follow him through the double doors that led to a sunlit corridor lined with portraits. Each painting was the same man, different ages. Taeyun's father, I realized. His eyes hard, his smile colder than stone. This house, Taeyun said as we walked, his voice low, was built on loyalty and blood. Everything you see here was earned, not inherited. I looked at him, trying to read between the lines. And what did you earn it with? He stopped walking, turning toward me slowly. Everything I had to lose. The way he said it, quiet, unflinching, made me realize there were ghosts in these walls, and they all had his name on them. He showed me the rest of the house, the private gym, the library, the garden that stretched across the rooftop like an oasis suspended above chaos. Everywhere we went, there were eyes, guards, maids, men pretending not to watch but watching all the same. And every time I looked at him, I saw something I couldn't quite name. Something dangerous, yes, but also deeply human. Like he was fighting a war I couldn't see. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city lights bled through the curtains, painting the walls in ghostly gold, and I sat by the window, watching cars drift like fireflies below. Somewhere down the hall, music played softly, a haunting melody on piano, slow and aching. I followed the sound, barefoot, my heartbeat keeping time with every step. The doors to the study were slightly open, and through the crack, I saw him. Taeyun, sitting at the piano, his sleeves rolled up, his expression unguarded for once. The melody was heartbreak itself, spilling from his fingers with a kind of reverence that didn't fit the man I'd seen command a room with a single word. For a long moment, I just watched. And then he spoke without looking up. You shouldn't wander alone at night. I froze, the hair on my arms rising. I couldn't sleep, I said softly. He stopped playing, turning his head just enough for me to see the faintest ghost of a smile. Neither can I. The silence stretched, heavy and intimate. I don't belong here, I whispered finally. He nodded slowly. No, he said, his gaze holding mine. But that doesn't matter anymore. He stood then, crossing the room until he was close enough for me to feel the warmth of his breath. You've seen enough of this house to understand what it is. Every room has a story. Every wall hides a sin. And now, Amara, you're part of it. Something in his tone, not threat, not promise, but prophecy, made my stomach twist. Because for the first time I realized he wasn't keeping me here just for protection. He was keeping me here because he needed me. And whatever that meant, it was only the beginning. The invitation came that evening. Or maybe it wasn't an invitation so much as a command dressed in velvet. A simple message slipped beneath my door on thick cream paper embossed with gold lettering that said, Dinner. 8 p.m., wear black. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. There was only one man in this house who spoke without speaking, who expected obedience not because he asked for it, but because the air around him demanded it. When I unfolded the dress laid across the bed, silk, fitted, soft as breath but dark as sin, I felt that same strange tightness in my chest that I always felt around him, the one that made it impossible to tell whether it was fear or something much more dangerous. I told myself it was only fear, that no woman in her right mind could feel anything else for a man like Zhang Taeyun. But deep down, I already knew I was lying to myself, because fear and fascination share the same heartbeat, and mine was already betraying me. By the time the clock struck 8, I had convinced myself to keep my chin high, to act unafraid, to pretend I belonged in this place that pulsed with quiet power and whispered danger. When I stepped into the dining hall, the first thing that struck me was the sheer weight of silence that hung in the room. Not emptiness, but the kind of silence that hums with secrets, with eyes that see too much and mouths that know better than to speak. The table stretched endlessly, polished wood gleaming under chandeliers that looked like frozen fire. Men were already seated, all in dark suits, their faces half-shadowed and their gazes flicking toward me as if trying to decide whether I was a curiosity, a threat, or a mistake. And at the head of it all sat Taiyun, the man who had turned my life into a question I couldn't stop asking. His black suit perfectly tailored, his expression calm in that unnerving way that made everyone else look slightly off balance just by existing near him. When he saw me, his gaze lingered for a fraction too long. Not with warmth, not even with approval, but with a quiet, possessive acknowledgement, like a painter assessing the final brushstroke of a piece he hadn't realized he'd been creating. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair beside him, and though his voice was soft, there was no room for refusal. As I moved, I could feel every eye following me. The man nearest to me, broad-shouldered, scar tracing down his jaw like an unfinished sentence, gave a low chuckle that didn't quite reach amusement. "Our boss has interesting taste," he said in Korean, but his tone carried enough venom that even I, who only caught fragments, understood the insult. I saw Taeyun's hand move before I even processed what had happened. A blur of motion, fast and precise, and the sound of a glass shattering filled the silence like thunder. The man froze, blood trickling from where shards had nicked his hand. Taeyun didn't raise his voice, didn't even look angry. "Watch your tongue when you speak about my wife," he said, the words slow and sharp, each one landing like a blade. The room went dead still. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, the air thick with tension and the metallic tang of fear. I should have been terrified, and I was. But there was also something else. Something darker that unfurled in the pit of my stomach. The strange, guilty knowledge that part of me liked how he'd said my wife. How he'd claimed me with such quiet finality that it left no room for doubt or argument. The rest of the dinner was a blur of half-heard conversations and clinking glasses. I tried to eat, but my appetite had vanished somewhere between the shattered glass and the weight of Taeyun's presence beside me. Occasionally, his hand would brush against mine as he reached for something, and each time it happened, I felt a spark that left my fingers tingling long after he withdrew. When the others finally rose from the table, murmuring their goodbyes with a mix of fear and reverence, he remained seated, swirling the wine in his glass, his gaze fixed on nothing. The chandelier light caught in the liquid, turning it the color of blood. "Why did you do that?" I asked finally, my voice low but steady. He glanced at me, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "Do what?" "Defend me like that. You could have just ignored him. You didn't have to—" "Break his hand?" he finished for me, his tone almost amused. "I did." "That's not normal," I said, trying to keep my tone sharp even though my pulse was still erratic. He smiled faintly, setting the glass down. "You're right. Nothing about me is normal." There was something in the way he said it. Not pride, not warning, just truth, that made my breath catch. I wanted to look away, but his gaze held mine, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around us, the air between us tightening until it was almost unbearable. "Do you always hurt people to prove a point?" I asked quietly. "Only when words aren't enough." He stood then, moving toward the window, hands slipping into his pockets. "These men follow strength, not kindness. If they think you make me weak, they'll test that theory." I had to remind them what happens when they forget who I am. "And who are you exactly?" He turned, the city lights reflecting in his eyes like distant fire. "The man you shouldn't have fallen asleep next to," he said simply. I laughed, sharp, bitter, disbelieving, because there was nothing else I could do. "You think I had a choice?" "No one ever does," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me stop laughing immediately. "Not with me." He started walking toward me, each step deliberate, slow, and by the time he stopped in front of me, I could feel the heat of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You shouldn't look at me like that," he said softly. "Like what?" "Like you want to understand me." The words sank into me like smoke, curling around everything I didn't want to admit. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak, he reached out and touched a strand of hair that had fallen across my shoulder, twirling it between his fingers before letting it fall. "You'll get hurt if you try," he murmured. "I already am," I whispered. His jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat something flickered behind his eyes. Something raw, unguarded, almost human. But then it was gone, and the mask slipped back into place. "Go to bed, Amara. It's been a long night." I wanted to ask more, about the men at dinner, about the name Jang Syndicate that had been whispered like a prayer and a curse in equal measure. But I knew it was useless. Taiyun gave information the way the ocean gives back what it takes, rarely, and only when it wanted to remind you who was in control. As I walked back through the empty hallway, my heels clicking softly against the marble, I could still feel his gaze on me, not watching, but claiming, like the ghost of a touch that wouldn't fade. In my room, I stood before the mirror, staring at my reflection. The black silk dress, the faint smudge of lipstick, the wide eyes of a woman who no longer recognized herself. The city lights spilled across my skin like spilled gold, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe this wasn't a nightmare I'd wake from, but a story I was being rewritten into. I didn't know what he wanted from me, not really. "Protection," he said. "Control, maybe." But there was something else in his eyes tonight. Something that had nothing to do with business or power. Something that looked almost like recognition. And that terrified me more than anything. Because if I was starting to see the man behind the monster, then maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the woman behind the pawn. And in this house of shadows, that could be the most dangerous thing of all. The night after the dinner felt heavier than the others that came before, as if the walls themselves had soaked up the tension that had lingered between us at that table, the blood that had dripped from that man's hand, the silence that had followed his apology. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something subtle but powerful, a quiet storm forming beneath the polished marble floors and glass walls of that immaculate mansion where danger and luxury slept side by side. I didn't see Taiyun the next morning, but his presence still filled the air, as if the rooms themselves had learned to breathe in rhythm with his moods. His name was on every whispered conversation, his shadow in every corner, and even when I tried to focus on the world outside the window, the pulse of soul, the hum of life that had nothing to do with me, I could still feel him, like a thread tied invisibly around my wrist, tugging gently every time I tried to forget him. Around noon, Minho appeared instead, leaning casually in the doorway of the library as though he had been there all along, his grin too charming to be harmless. "You really don't belong here," he said in that lilting voice of his, the kind that could melt into a whisper and still sound like a secret you wanted to hear. "I've gathered that," I said dryly, closing the book I hadn't been reading. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "You know, most people would kill for a place at this table. Power, money, respect. You, though." He tilted his head, his gaze flicking over me. "You just look like you want to run." "Maybe I do." He smiled, but there was something sharp underneath it. "I could help you, you know, if you ever wanted to leave. My brother isn't the only one who knows how to move people across borders." I studied him, trying to decide if this was kindness or a trap. "Why would you help me?" He shrugged lightly. "Because I don't like watching beautiful things get caged, and because maybe it would be fun to see him lose control for once." There it was. The truth, gleaming like a knife between us. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed in the hall. That unmistakable, deliberate rhythm that belonged only to one man. Minho's smile faltered, just slightly, before he turned toward the sound. Taiyun entered the room without a word, dressed in black again, his eyes flicking from his brother to me with that calm intensity that could strip the soul bare. "Minho," he said quietly. "Hyung," Minho replied, all feigned innocence and lazy charm. "I was just keeping your wife company. She seems lonely." Taiyun didn't respond right away. His gaze lingered on me for a heartbeat too long before he said, "Find something better to do with your time." For a moment, I thought Minho would argue. There was a flash of rebellion in his eyes, something wild and reckless. But then he only smirked, offered a mock bow, and left the room with that same easy swagger that somehow managed to feel like a threat. When he was gone, the silence between Taiyun and me grew thick enough to touch. "Stay away from him," he said finally, his tone low, the warning quiet but unmistakable. "I didn't invite him," I replied, standing slowly. "And I'm not exactly in a position to turn people away, am I? Considering you've turned this place into a prison." He exhaled, and for the briefest second I thought I saw exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that runs deeper than sleep. "You don't understand what Minho is capable of." "Then explain it to me," I said, taking a step closer, my pulse betraying the defiance in my voice. "Explain anything to me, because I'm tired of being kept in the dark like some—" Before I could finish, he moved, faster than I could track, closing the distance between us until the air itself felt electric. "You think I owe you explanations?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. But there was something else in it too. Something fraying at the edges, like restraint stretched too thin. "No," I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I think you owe me the truth." He stared at me for a long moment, and then to my surprise, he laughed. A quiet, humorless sound that didn't belong in this house. "The truth," he repeated softly. "The truth is that I killed my father to protect this family. The truth is that I've been hunted since the day I took this chair. The truth, Amara, is that the only reason you're alive is because I decided you were worth the risk." The words hit like gunfire, not because of what they meant, but because of the way he said them, with that haunting mixture of pride and regret, like he'd stopped believing he could tell the difference between right and necessary. I wanted to hate him for it. I really did. But the longer I looked at him, at the man who had built his world from blood and ashes, and somehow still carried himself like royalty, the harder it became to separate the monster from the man. That night, the storm finally broke. I was in my room, trying to lose myself in the sound of the rain against the windows, when the door burst open and two men I didn't recognize stumbled inside, their suits stained with water and something darker. One of them grabbed my arm, whispering in broken English, "You come with us. Boss says move." I barely had time to gasp before the hallway exploded with noise, gunfire, shouts, the crash of glass. And Taiyun appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of fury, his gun drawn. What happened next blurred into chaos. The sharp crack of bullets, the acrid sting of gunpowder, the sight of one man dropping soundlessly while the other ran. Taiyun caught him halfway down the hall, slammed him into the wall so hard the plaster cracked, and spoke in Korean so cold it made my blood freeze. When he pulled the trigger, the silence afterward was deafening. I was shaking when he turned back to me, blood spattered across his sleeve, eyes still burning from the fight. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, without a word, he crossed the distance between us and pulled me into his arms. I don't know if it was instinct or madness that made me stay there, pressed against him while his heart pounded against mine, his breath ragged against my ear. He smelled of smoke and metal and something impossibly human, and I realized with terrifying clarity that for all his darkness, he was the first person in this country who had made me feel safe. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper against my hair. "They were sent by Minho's allies. He wants what's mine." I pulled back just enough to look at him, my chest still tight. And what exactly is yours? He looked down at me, his expression unreadable. Everything in this house, he said softly, including you. I should have pushed him away. I should have screamed, but instead I found myself staring up at him, unable to move, caught between fear and the kind of ache that burned too deep to name. He lifted his hand, brushed his thumb along my jaw, and for a moment the world went silent. The rain, the wind, even my thoughts. And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was desperate, claiming, almost violent in its intensity, as though he was trying to remind himself I was real, that I was still breathing, that after everything he'd lost, there was still something in this world he hadn't destroyed. When he finally pulled away, I was trembling, my lips swollen, my mind spinning. You should hate me, he said quietly. Maybe I do, I whispered back. But that doesn't change what just happened. His jaw tightened, his eyes searching mine for something neither of us could name. Go to bed, Amara, he said finally, his voice rougher than before. Tomorrow we end this. And what? I asked, but he was already gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone with the echo of gunfire and the taste of him still on my lips. That night, as the rain whispered secrets against the glass, I realized that whatever war was coming, between brothers, between truth and loyalty, between love and ruin, I was already in the middle of it. And whether I wanted to or not, I was bleeding for him already. Morning came softly, the kind of deceptive calm that makes you forget the storm that tore through the night before, the kind that paints everything in pale light and quiet sounds, as though the world itself is trying to convince you that nothing happened, that blood wasn't spilled, that bullets didn't sing through the air like metallic whispers, that I didn't feel the heat of his body pressed against mine as he killed to keep me breathing. But I remembered everything. The smell of gunpowder still clung to my skin, the echo of his kiss still pulsed on my lips, and no amount of sunlight could wash away the dark weight of what had been born between us. I sat by the window wrapped in one of the silk robes the maid had left out, watching the river wind through Seoul like a silver scar, and for the first time since I had arrived in this country, I realized I no longer wanted to leave, or at least, I no longer knew if I could. Fear had changed its shape inside me. It no longer screamed for escape, but hummed low and steady, a strange rhythm that matched his. When the door opened, I thought it would be one of the housekeepers, quiet and polite, carrying tea or breakfast. But it was him, Jang Tae-yoon, the man who had stolen my freedom and replaced it with something I didn't have a name for. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes unreadable, his hair slightly tousled, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a faint bruise darkening the edge of his jaw from whatever fight had followed after I'd fallen asleep. You didn't knock, I said, my voice calm, even though my heart was already betraying me, thrumming with that familiar mix of defiance and desire that he seemed to summon just by existing. I didn't think I needed to, he replied, stepping inside with that unhurried grace that made the space bend around him. After all, this is my house, and you... His eyes flicked to me, slow and deliberate. Are my wife. I let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. You keep saying that like it's true. He tilted his head slightly, and for a moment there was almost amusement in his gaze. It is true, Amara, at least on paper. You saw the documents. Documents you forged, I reminded him, my voice sharp enough to cut the air between us. You think you can just write my name next to yours and make it real? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, every step deliberate, and stopped close enough that I could smell the faint trace of smoke and leather on his clothes. The thing about lies, he said softly, is that if enough people believe them, they stop being lies. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. So that's it? You decide what's true and the world just agrees? He gave a small, humorless smile. That's how power works. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city below, the muted rush of traffic, the whisper of silk as I shifted under his gaze. I wanted to hate him for the ease with which he moved through this world of deception and violence, but I also couldn't ignore the way he carried it, the way he bore the weight of it all without flinching, as if the darkness was a language only he spoke fluently. Finally, I asked, "So what happens now? You said last night that we would end this. What did you mean?" He looked past me, out the window, his jaw tightening. "Minho," he said quietly. "He's moving, against me. Last night was only a warning." "And you think I'm part of it?" I said, not asking but stating, because I'd already seen the suspicion flicker in his eyes too many times not to know. He turned to me sharply, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "I don't think," he said, his voice low and precise. "I know that someone connected you to him. I just don't know if it was you or the people who sent you here." Something inside me cracked then, not loudly but deeply, the kind of break that doesn't make sound because it's been forming for too long. "You think I'm capable of betraying you?" I whispered, my voice shaking despite everything I'd done to keep it steady. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the storm behind his calm. "I think you're capable of surviving," he said, "and people who want to survive will do anything." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You think survival makes me a liar?" "No," he said quietly. "It makes you dangerous." He turned away then, walking toward the door, but I couldn't let him go, not with those words hanging between us like a blade. "You talk about me like I'm one of them," I said, standing. "But I'm not. I never asked for this. I never wanted to be part of your world, and if you had just let me walk away that day at the airport—" He spun around, his voice cutting through mine like thunder. "If I had let you walk away, you'd be dead." The silence that followed was absolute. He took a slow breath, his voice softer when he spoke again. "You don't understand what this is, Amara. You're not just in danger because of me. You're in danger because you were seen with me. The moment you fell asleep on that plane, your life stopped being your own." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down I knew he wasn't. The truth was there, plain and cruel. I wasn't safe because of him, but I wasn't safe without him either. He looked at me for a long time, and then, almost reluctantly, he said, "There's a meeting tonight. I want you there." I blinked. "A meeting?" "With the council, the people who keep this city balanced on its knife edge." He paused, his gaze heavy. "You'll see what kind of world you've married into." That night, the house transformed. The quiet corridors filled with movement. Men in dark suits, women in elegant dresses, guards at every door. It was like watching a kingdom prepare for war beneath the guise of luxury. Taiyun appeared just before we left, his suit darker than midnight, a single white rose pinned to his lapel. "It's tradition," he said when he saw me staring. "The color of peace." I didn't tell him it looked more like surrender. The meeting was held in a penthouse overlooking the city, a place where wealth and sin blended so seamlessly you couldn't tell one from the other. The room was full of men who looked like they owned pieces of the world, their smiles sharp and cold, their laughter like polished glass. When Taiyun entered with me beside him, the noise died instantly. Eyes turned, whispers followed. I felt the weight of their scrutiny, the disbelief that he would bring me here. Me, the foreigner, the outsider, the woman who had no right to stand in this circle of power. "Interesting choice," one man said with a smirk. "Your wife, I presume." Taiyun's hand found mine, his grip firm. "Yes," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. There it was again. That word, wife, falling from his lips like a weapon he'd learned to wield. I didn't know if he said it to protect me or to claim me, and maybe it didn't matter anymore because either way, it worked. The room quieted. The rest of the night passed in a haze of conversation I barely understood. Talk of shipments, alliances, betrayals, names I didn't recognize. But beneath it all, there was a hum of tension, an undercurrent of danger that made every smile feel rehearsed, every gesture a calculation. When it was over, we stepped out onto the balcony. The cold night air washing over us. Sol glittered below, vast and indifferent. "You shouldn't have brought me," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. "You made me part of this." He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "You were part of it the moment you touched my shoulder," he said. "Everything since then has only been truth catching up to you." I stared at him, the city reflected in his eyes like 1,000 burning stars. "And this marriage?" I asked. "Is that truth too?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, handing it to me. "It was supposed to be a lie," he said softly, "but somewhere along the way, I made it real." Inside, there was a legal document, freshly stamped and signed, my name beside his in ink that hadn't even dried. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. He stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Now you understand, Amara. You can't run from something that already owns your name." And as the wind whipped around us, carrying the sounds of the city below, I realized that whatever freedom I thought I had left had just vanished, and that maybe, just maybe, part of me didn't want it back. It was strange how silence could sound so loud in a house full of secrets. Days had passed since that night on the balcony when Taeyun had handed me that cursed document, the one that tied my name to his forever, written not in love but in ink and power. And though the paper lay folded in the top drawer of my vanity, it might as well have been a brand burned into my skin. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw it, the quiet weight of belonging to a man who didn't believe in accidents, a man who turned lies into truth simply by speaking them aloud. I had tried to pretend I didn't care, that it was just another manipulation, another thread in the web he had wrapped around me. But there were moments when I'd catch myself wondering what would happen if it wasn't a lie anymore. If somewhere between the bullets and the whispers and the stolen glances, something real had begun to grow in the cracks. That was the most dangerous thought of all, the possibility that I might be falling for the man who had taken everything from me. The house had been quieter than usual lately, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The guards spoke less, the maids avoided my eyes, and Taeyun spent long hours locked in his study, emerging only when he needed to command or destroy. He was preparing for something. I could feel it in the way his shoulders stayed tense, the way his phone never left his hand, the way he didn't touch me anymore even though his gaze sometimes lingered as if he wanted to. One morning I woke to find a dress laid across the bed, black silk, embroidered with delicate red thread that shimmered like blood in sunlight, and next to it, a note in his precise handwriting. "Dinner tonight. 7. Do not be late." There was no signature, no reason, no explanation, and I told myself I wouldn't go, that I'd had enough of his commands. But when 7 came, I was there, because every time I told myself I could resist him, I discovered just how easily he could make obedience feel like choice. The dining hall was dimly lit, the chandelier above casting fractured light that danced across the glass and gold. Taeyun was already seated, his expression unreadable, his tie undone just enough to make him look human again. "You came?" he said, not as a question, but as a fact he had been sure of. "I didn't know I had an option," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. But he only smiled faintly. that slow, knowing curve of his mouth that always felt like it saw too much. "There are always options," he said softly. "You just don't like any of them." Dinner was quiet at first, the silence thick with unspoken things. I wanted to ask him what this was, a peace offering, a test, or just another performance. But before I could find the words, the door opened and Minho walked in. He looked different that night. More polished, more dangerous. His hair slicked back, his suit immaculate. A glint of amusement in his eyes that made my skin prickle. He smiled when he saw me. That lazy, practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You didn't tell me we were having company, Hyung," he said smoothly as he took a seat at the far end of the table. Taeyoon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't think you'd be invited." Minho laughed, the sound low and rich, but edged with something venomous. "And yet here I am." For the rest of the meal, I could feel the tension between them like static in the air. Every word was a game, every smile a veiled threat. I sat in silence, watching the two men who shared blood but nothing else. One a storm barely contained, the other a serpent waiting to strike. After dessert was served, Minho leaned back in his chair, his gaze settling on me. "You know, Amara," he said casually, "I used to think my brother didn't have a heart. But it seems he's found one after all. You should be proud." Taeyoon's hand froze mid-motion, his eyes snapping to Minho with a warning so sharp I could almost feel it slice through the air. "Enough." But Minho only smiled, unfazed. "I'm just saying, it's interesting how quickly things change. One moment she's a stranger, the next she's your wife, and now—" He trailed off, his gaze flicking toward me again, slower this time, heavier. "Now she's part of your empire. Impressive, really." The unease that had been coiling in my stomach all night finally broke into something sharper. "What are you implying?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He tilted his head. "Only that people tend to forget who brought them into this world, and who can take them out just as easily." "Minho," Taeyoon said quietly, "you're crossing a line." "Am I?" Minho's smile widened. "Or are you just afraid she'll find out the truth before you're ready to tell her?" The room went still, and for a heartbeat I could swear I heard my own pulse echoing off the walls. "What truth?" I asked, looking from one brother to the other. But neither of them answered. Minho stood first, buttoning his jacket with deliberate slowness. "You should ask him," he said, his voice suddenly soft, almost gentle. "You deserve to know who you're really married to." And then he left, his footsteps echoing down the hall until they vanished. Taeyoon stayed seated, his hand clenched so tightly around his glass that I thought it might shatter. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, dangerous. "Don't listen to him." "What is he talking about?" I asked, standing. "What truth?" He didn't look at me, just stared into the wine as though he could drown something in it. "It doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" My voice rose despite myself. "He's your brother, Taeyoon, and he's hinting that there's something you've been hiding. You think that doesn't concern me when I'm the one trapped in your house, tied to your name, dragged into your war?" He looked up then, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You don't want the truth, Amara." "Yes, I do," I said, my voice trembling with something between anger and desperation. "Because I'm tired of being the only one in this marriage who doesn't know what the hell is real." He stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and for a moment, I thought he might tell me. But then he stepped closer instead, his hand reaching up to brush against my cheek with that same unbearable gentleness he always used when his words were cruelest. "The truth is a weapon," he said quietly. "And I don't trust anyone else to hold it, not even you." Something inside me broke then. Not the kind of break that bleeds, but the kind that leaves a hollow echo behind. I pulled back, his hand falling away. "You don't trust me," I said, and though I tried to sound angry, it came out more like heartbreak. He didn't deny it. I left the room before he could say another word. That night I couldn't sleep. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. I paced the length of my room until my body ached, and finally, driven by something I didn't understand, I slipped out into the hallway. The house was dark, silent except for the faint hum of electricity and the distant whisper of rain against the windows. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my feet seemed to know where they were going. Down the corridor, past the locked study, to the door at the end that I'd never seen opened. It wasn't guarded. That should have been my first warning. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the glow of a single computer screen. Files were stacked neatly on the desk, photos, papers, letters, and in the middle of it all, my name. My heart stopped. There were pictures of me from before I ever got on that plane. In Atlanta, walking to work, buying groceries, even one taken from across the street near my apartment. Reports, dates, notes in Korean. Someone had been watching me for months. But the worst part wasn't that someone had been watching. It was that every document was marked with a seal I recognized. The same one on the paper Taeyun had given me, the one that had made our marriage real. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The realization came slow and cold, that maybe Minho hadn't lied, that maybe the real betrayal wasn't his but Taeyun's, that the man who claimed to protect me might have been the one who had orchestrated everything from the beginning. I didn't hear him enter the room, but I felt it. The shift in the air. The weight of his presence behind me. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged with danger. I turned slowly, the file trembling in my hands. "You tell me," I said, my voice breaking. "Why were you watching me before we ever met?" For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an answer ready. His silence said more than words ever could. And in that silence, the love I hadn't wanted to admit I felt began to die. Quietly. Painfully. Like a rose crushed beneath the weight of its own thorns. The night I discovered the truth, or what I thought was the truth, was the night everything inside me began to unravel. Thread by thread. Like a tapestry coming undone beneath its own weight. And as I stood in that cold room staring down at the scattered papers that documented my life before Korea, my life before him, I felt something inside me fracture so quietly that I almost mistook it for the sound of my own heartbeat breaking. The air around me was heavy. The silence, a living thing pressing against my ears, and behind me I could still feel his presence, steady, controlled, immovable, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "You were watching me," I said, the words scraping out of my throat like they'd been dragged across glass, my fingers clutching one of the photos so tightly that the edges cut into my skin. "Before the plane, before all of this, you knew who I was." Taeyun didn't answer right away, which somehow hurt more than any denial could have, because his silence had never been empty. It was deliberate, purposeful, like he was deciding how much of me deserved the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, stripped of that usual calm precision. "You were a name on a list," he said. "Nothing more at first. Someone connected to a man I was already hunting. I didn't know who you were until it was too late." "Too late for what?" I demanded, my voice rising before I could stop it. "Too late to stop ruining my life? Too late to tell me the truth? Or too late to pretend you hadn't already decided what I was worth?" He took a slow step toward me, and for a moment I saw something break in his expression, something raw and unguarded, and it terrified me more than his control ever had. "Too late," he said quietly, "to stay away from you." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with all the words we'd never said, and I wanted to scream at him, to hit him, to make him bleed the way I was bleeding inside, but instead I dropped the papers, my hands trembling as they fell like ash to the floor between us. "You don't get to say that," I whispered. "You don't get to stand there and talk about feelings when everything between us started as a lie." He moved closer, and I backed away instinctively, the edge of the desk pressing into my spine. "It stopped being a lie," he said, his voice rough, the moment I realized I couldn't let you go. I shook my head, tears burning behind my eyes. "You don't let go of anything, Tae-yoon. You just take until there's nothing left." That was when I saw it. The faint twitch in his jaw. The flicker of something that looked almost like guilt. And I knew I had to get out. The house felt smaller suddenly. Suffocating, every hallway a reminder that I'd been living inside his cage, gilded and beautiful but still a prison. "I'm leaving," I said, forcing the words out even though I didn't believe them yet. His gaze sharpened. "You can't. Watch me." The moment I turned, he grabbed my wrist, not roughly, not cruelly, but firmly enough that I could feel the promise of restraint beneath his fingers. "You think you can run from me?" he asked, his voice low, his control fraying at the edges. "You don't even know what's out. They are waiting for you. You think Minho will protect you? He'll use you the same way they all tried to use you." "Maybe," I said, meeting his eyes even though my heart was hammering so hard it hurt. "But at least I'll still be free." His grip loosened, just slightly, and in that small mercy, I found my chance. I pulled away before he could stop me, the movement so sudden that it left his hand hanging in the air like a ghost of something that used to matter. I didn't wait for him to follow. I ran. The corridors blurred as I moved through them, the echo of my bare feet against the marble swallowed by the pounding in my ears. The front doors were guarded, of course, but I remembered the side gate, the one that led down to the garden below, and from there, the narrow path through the hedge that I'd seen one of the maids use weeks ago to bring in flowers. My hands shook as I shoved the latch open, the metal cold against my skin, and the night air hit me like freedom, sharp, electric, terrifying. I didn't look back. The city unfolded before me in a blur of neon and shadow, a labyrinth of alleys and light that felt both alive and hostile. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and every sound, every car, every footstep felt like it could belong to him. I ducked into a narrow alley, pressing myself against the cold wall, trying to catch my breath. My pulse racing so fast it made the edges of my vision blur. When I finally dared to look up, I realized I was standing near a district that didn't belong to the clean, polished Seoul Taeyoon's world occupied. The lights here were dimmer, the streets dirtier, the air thick with the scent of rain and cheap cigarettes. I moved quietly, pulling the hood of my coat tighter around my face. But I could feel eyes on me. Men watching, calculating, the kind of men who recognized fear and knew how to use it. It was almost a relief when I heard a familiar voice cut through the noise. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" I turned sharply, and there he was, Minho, leaning against a lamppost with that same infuriating smirk, his coat collar turned up, his hands shoved casually into his pockets, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice low, defensive. "Want?" He laughed softly. "You came to me, sweetheart. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Don't call me that," I snapped, but the exhaustion in my voice made it sound hollow. He pushed off the lamppost and started toward me, his expression softening slightly. "He hurt you, didn't he?" I didn't answer, and that was answer enough. "I told you he doesn't protect anything he can't control," Minho said, his voice quieter now. "You were just another pawn to him, but you don't have to be anymore." I should have known better than to trust the softness in his tone, but desperation does strange things to people. I was cold, frightened, and utterly alone in a city that had never belonged to me. so when he held out his hand, I took it. He led me to a car parked a few blocks away, sleek but unmarked, and as we drove through the maze of streets, the tension in my chest began to shift. Not easing, exactly, but transforming into something sharper, something like suspicion. Minho was humming softly under his breath, his fingers drumming against the wheel, and in the brief flashes of passing streetlights, I saw the shadow of satisfaction flicker across his face. "Where are we going?" I asked finally. "Somewhere safe," he said, too easily. "Your version of safe or mine?" He smiled without looking at me. "You'll see." The car stopped in front of a building that looked abandoned, its windows boarded, its sign long faded. Inside, though, the lights were still on. Men lingered in the corners, watching us as we entered, and my stomach dropped as I recognized the symbol etched into the wall. The same mark I'd seen on the files in Taiyun's study, the same emblem stamped onto the papers that had marked me as his wife. "What is this?" I whispered. Minho turned to me, his eyes gleaming. "Welcome to the other side of the family business." It hit me all at once. The truth, the trap, the terrible symmetry of it all. I hadn't escaped Taiyun. I'd just traded one cage for another. He smiled then, slow and deliberate, stepping closer until the scent of his cologne filled the air between us. "You really thought he was the one watching you?" he murmured. "You think my brother moves without me knowing? You were never his mistake, Amara. You were mine." The world tilted, and before I could move, two men stepped forward from the shadows, their hands closing around my arms. "Don't fight," Minho said softly. "You've already chosen a side." But I wasn't his, and I wasn't Taiyun's, not anymore. I twisted free, kicking hard enough to break one man's hold, then ran for the door, the sound of shouting behind me blending with the thunder that had started to roll through the night sky. Outside, the rain was falling hard, drenching everything in silver light, and I ran without thinking, without direction, only one thought pounding through my head like a prayer and a curse at once. I have to survive. And somewhere behind me, in the distance, I thought I heard him. Taiyun's voice, low and furious, shouting my name like it was the only thing he'd ever lost that mattered. Rain has a way of erasing things, footprints, scents, boundaries, and as I ran through the narrow back streets of Seoul, soaked to the bone and blinded by neon reflections bleeding into puddles, I almost believed it could erase me too. My lungs burned with every breath, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might break free of my chest. But I couldn't stop. Behind me I could still hear them, Minho's men, their shouts echoing through the labyrinth of alleyways, their boots striking wet pavement like thunder. The city had turned into a battlefield, and I was the ghost haunting it, running not just from them, but from the truth that had finally caught up to me. Every corner I turned felt the same. Every streetlight flickered like a dying star, and with every step, I could feel the walls closing in, the choices narrowing until all that was left was the terrible certainty that there was nowhere left to hide. The air tasted of smoke and rain, of something metallic and inevitable, and as I stumbled past a shuttered convenience store, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass. Wide eyes, pale face, hair plastered to my skin. And for the first time, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. I had come to Korea chasing a new life, a dream of purpose, of independence, of escape from the quiet emptiness of everything I'd left behind. But now I was running for my life in a city where even my name didn't belong to me anymore. Jang Amara, the forged wife, the accidental pawn, the girl who had fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder and woken up in someone else's story. The sound of engines roared somewhere behind me, closer now, and instinct screamed louder than thought. I darted into an alley so narrow that the walls brushed against my shoulders, climbed a rusted staircase that rattled beneath my weight, and forced open a door that led to a rooftop drenched in moonlight. The rain hit me in cold sheets, the wind slicing through the fabric of my dress. And for a brief, shattering moment, the city below looked almost beautiful. An endless sea of light and chaos, glittering like broken glass scattered across the earth. I pressed my back against the wall, forcing myself to breathe, to think. I needed a plan, a direction, anything. But all I could think about was him. Tae-yoon. His voice. The way he'd said my name like it meant something. The way he'd looked at me that night after the gunfire when his hands had still been trembling from killing for me. I wanted to hate him. But hate had always been easier than love, and easier things don't last. A door slammed somewhere below, the echo slicing through the rain. I froze, my pulse stuttering. Then another sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, confident. When he appeared, it wasn't Minho, it was Tae-yoon. For a heartbeat, everything inside me stopped. He looked like he had been carved from the storm itself, his suit drenched, his hair slicked back, his face pale except for the bruise darkening along his jaw, and his eyes, God, his eyes, burned with something I couldn't name. Anger, fear, relief, love, maybe all of it. "Amara," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You shouldn't have run." I laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "You watched me, lied to me, trapped me, and now you're telling me I shouldn't have run?" "I did what I had to do," he said, taking a step forward. "You don't understand what was at stake." "Don't I?" I spat. "I was never a person to you, was I? Just a tool, a name, a weakness you could use when it suited you." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "If that were true, I wouldn't be here." "Then why are you here?" I demanded, the rain running down my face like tears I refused to shed. "To drag me back? To finish what you started?" "No," he said quietly, stepping closer, his voice raw. "To save you. Because Minho isn't going to stop until he has you." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You think I can't tell when two men are fighting over power and pretending it's about me?" His expression hardened, his gaze flicking toward the edge of the rooftop where headlights cut through the rain far below. "This isn't about pretending. You're the reason he's moving against me. He doesn't just want my throne. He wants to destroy everything I care about. And right now that means you." The words hit me harder than I wanted them to. "You don't get to say that," I whispered. He took another step toward me, close enough now that I could see the rain dripping from his lashes. "You don't get to decide what I feel," he said, and his voice trembled for the first time since I'd known him. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, a gunshot split the air. It came from below, sharp, violent, final, and then another. Tae-yoon moved instantly, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me behind the low wall at the edge of the roof. "They found us," he said through gritted teeth. I peeked over the wall just long enough to see dark figures moving through the alley, flashes of light glinting off their weapons. The sound of footsteps grew louder, heavier, and in that moment I realized that this wasn't a rescue. It was an execution waiting to happen. "Go," I said, trying to pull away. "You can't protect me and fight them at the same time." His grip tightened. "I'm not leaving you." "Then you'll die." "Maybe," he said, meeting my eyes, "but at least it won't be for nothing." Another gunshot rang out, this one closer, the bullet sparking against the metal railing inches from where I crouched. Tae-yoon pulled his own gun from his jacket, his movements precise and practiced, and fired back. The sound was deafening, the recoil jarring, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the wet air. I pressed my hands over my ears, shaking. The noise and chaos blurring into something that felt almost unreal. When it was over, or maybe just paused, Tae-yoon's breathing was ragged, his shoulder bleeding where a bullet had grazed him, and still he stayed standing, his jaw set, his eyes locked on the door that led to the stairwell. "He's coming," Tae-yoon said, his voice low, certain, and he was right. The door burst open and Minho stepped onto the roof, his gun in one hand, his expression serene, almost bored, like he was walking into a meeting rather than a war. "Kyung," he said softly, his voice carrying easily through the rain. "You should have stayed in your castle. It doesn't suit you to bleed out here in the dirt." Taeyun lifted his weapon, his movements steady despite the blood staining his sleeve. "You shouldn't have touched her." Minho laughed, a cruel, humorless sound that made my stomach twist. "You always did think everything you touched belonged to you, even her." His eyes flicked to me, and for a heartbeat I saw the same darkness there that I had once seen in Taeyun's. "Tell me, Amara, which of us do you believe? Which devil do you want to save you?" "I don't want either of you," I said, though my voice trembled, and that only seemed to amuse him more. "Ah," he said softly, "but you don't get to choose anymore." He raised the gun, aiming not at me but at his brother, and the moment stretched, slow, infinite, unbearable. Taeyun moved first, stepping in front of me, the movement instinctive, absolute. The sound of the shot was a thunderclap that tore the world apart. The bullet hit him before I could scream. He staggered back, his body jerking with the impact, blood blooming through his shirt like a spreading shadow. I caught him before he fell completely, my hands pressed to his chest, warm liquid seeping between my fingers. His eyes found mine, still clear, still alive, still full of something that shouldn't have existed between us but did anyway. "Amara," he whispered, his breath catching. "Don't. Let him win." I wanted to tell him to stay, to fight, to breathe, but the words wouldn't come. The rain kept falling, washing the blood from his skin but not from my hands, and in that moment, I realized that I would never be the same again, that no matter what happened next, something inside me had already been marked forever by this man who had both ruined and saved me. Minho's voice broke through the sound of the storm, low and calm. "It's over, sister-in-law." I looked up at him, something fierce and hollow burning in my chest. "No," I said softly, my fingers tightening around Taeyun's gun, still slick with rain. "It's not." And before he could take another step, I lifted the weapon and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed through my body, the sound devoured by the rain. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Minho fell. And as the sirens began to wail somewhere far below, as the world tilted beneath me, I realized I was standing in the wreckage of every choice I had ever made, holding a dying man in my arms and a smoking gun in my hands. The night bled into morning without mercy, the storm finally quieting, as if the sky itself had grown exhausted from all the screaming. And I remember sitting there on that rooftop long after the sirens had faded, my body numb, my heart a hollow drum echoing in my chest, my hands still slick, with blood that the rain could never quite wash away. It was over. At least that's what I told myself, though nothing inside me believed it. Because the kind of endings that come after love and violence never arrive neatly wrapped in silence. They just leave you with echoes that keep you awake long after the world has moved on. Taeyun lay in my arms, his breathing shallow but steady. His eyes closed now, his skin pale in the weak dawn light that filtered through the thinning clouds. I had thought he was dead when he first fell, when the blood kept pouring out of him in waves, staining my hands, my dress, the concrete beneath us. But somehow, stubbornly, he had survived the night. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, missing his heart by inches. Maybe fate's last act of mercy, or maybe just another cruel joke from a universe that enjoyed dangling hope in front of people who didn't deserve it. Minho's body lay a few feet away, his blood mixing with the rainwater, his eyes open and empty now, staring up at a sky that would never look back. I had killed him. Me. Not out of fear, not even out of hate, but because in that moment when I saw Taeyun fall, something inside me had chosen a side without asking permission from reason or morality. and that choice had changed everything. When the sirens came closer again, when the flashing lights painted the rooftop in red and blue, I didn't run this time. I sat there holding him until the men in dark suits came, not police, not strangers, but his men, loyal to the very end. They said nothing, only moved with efficient silence, lifting him gently from my arms, carrying him down the stairs. And when one of them reached for me, I let him, because I didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The world blurred after that. Hospitals, questions, the endless, suffocating smell of antiseptic. I remember sitting by his bedside, my fingers brushing his hand, the steady beeping of the heart monitor the only sound between us. He slept for 2 days, drifting somewhere between life and death. And in that time, I thought about everything that had led me here. Every choice, every lie, every accidental step that had somehow turned into fate. They told me Minho's empire had crumbled before dawn, that his allies had scattered like rats when word spread of his death. They told me Taeyun's name was untouchable now, that the city would bow to him again, that everything was under control. But power had never been what haunted me. It was the silence that came afterward, the stillness that followed the storm, the realization that all the noise we had made had left only emptiness behind. When Taeyun finally opened his eyes, the first thing he did was look for me. I was sitting by the window, watching the city wake beneath a sky that looked newly born, and when his voice broke the silence, it was so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. "Amara." I turned, and there he was, alive, fragile, human in a way I had never seen him before. He looked at me like I was the only thing tethering him to this world, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, because words felt too small for what we had survived. "You shouldn't be here," he said eventually, his voice still rough, like it hurt to speak. I smiled faintly, even as my chest ached. "You've been saying that since the day we met, and I still haven't listened." A shadow of a smile flickered across his face, but it didn't last. "You killed him?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand tightening slightly against the blanket. "You shouldn't have had to." "I didn't do it for you," I said quietly, though even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. "I did it because I couldn't watch him take away what little good was left in you." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that broke me all over again. Something like sorrow, something like gratitude, something like love trying to survive in a place that had never been kind to it. "I don't deserve you," he said. "No," I said softly. "You don't. But that's not what this is about anymore." He frowned, and I could see the question forming in his eyes, so I stood, walked to his bedside, and brushed my fingers gently through his hair. "You taught me that love isn't something that saves us," I whispered. "It's something that ruins us beautifully. And maybe that's enough." He reached for my hand, his fingers trembling as they closed around mine. "Stay," he said. And for the first time, it wasn't a command. It was a plea. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to stay in that moment forever, in that fragile peace where everything felt possible again. But I couldn't. "I can't," I said, my voice barely a breath. "Not yet. I need to remember who I was before you." His hand slipped away slowly, his eyes searching mine. "And if you don't like who you find?" "Then maybe I'll come back," I said, forcing a small smile. "Or maybe I'll learn to live with her." The next morning, I left before the sun rose. No one tried to stop me. The city was waking again, the streets humming with life, the river glinting like a blade in the early light. I walked until the hospital disappeared behind me, until the sound of the world drowned out the echo of his voice in my mind. I didn't take anything with me except the memory of him, the sound of his laughter on the rare days it had existed, the way his eyes softened when he thought I wasn't looking, the weight of his hand against my skin. I carried him like a scar, like a reminder that sometimes the people who break us are also the ones who teach us how to feel again. Weeks passed. The papers called it the Soul Syndicate War. They printed pictures of the aftermath, headlines filled with names and crimes and victories, but none of them knew the truth, that it wasn't power that had been at stake that night. It was two souls too damaged to coexist, bound by something deeper than loyalty, sharper than love. I found a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one knew my name, where the air was quiet and the nights didn't echo with gunfire. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of black cars passing through the neighborhood, and though they never stopped, I always knew who they belonged to. He was watching still, not out of control this time, but out of care, the only way he knew how to love. Months later, a letter arrived. No return address, just my name written in his careful handwriting. Inside was a single line. The house is empty now, but the door is always open. I didn't cry. I just folded the letter, placed it in the drawer beside my bed, and sat there for a long time, staring at the city beyond the window. The same city that had once swallowed me whole and somehow, against all odds, given me back to myself. Sometimes at night, when the rain begins to fall and the air smells of smoke and wet stone, I think of him. The man who was both my captor and my salvation. The one who loved me not gently, but completely, in the only way he knew how. And though I don't know if I'll ever go back, I know this much. Love, when it's real, doesn't end when the story does. It lingers, in the air, in the heartbeat of a city that refuses to sleep, in the space between two people who have learned that even ruin can be beautiful. Maybe one day I'll walk through that open door again. Maybe I won't. But for now, the morning is quiet. The sky is clean, and for the first time in forever, the world feels like it's mine. And that, I think, is enough.